with you, man. I'm glad that we finally made it happen.
We're finally doing it.
And I just want to start with Lehi ThunderVoice Eagle, background on the name.
Okay, so my name, I'm actually from Navajo Nation, Dene, and then on my mom's side, my dad's side, I'm Totonac, which is from Mexico, the tribes from Mexico. And my name was actually given to me by my father when I was 10 years old. And so my birth name is Lehi, and then my given name is ThunderVoice Eagle. And so depending on where you're from and your community, naming is always a little different. And so my father, when I was 10, is when he felt like it was time for me that either I hadn't earned it or it was time for me to receive a name that was, in a sense, helped with understanding my potential and also giving some direction and some warning as well. Mm-hmm. So when he named me, he actually, I was 10, so he made it really simple. He said, ThunderVoice Eagle is your name. Thunder, because when you talk, it'll be like a voice of thunder that will carry your words to the hearts of the children of men. And he says Eagle because you belong in the sky close to the Creator and not on the ground with the turkeys, is what he said. So,
and what's a little bit of his background?
So my father, so he's actually from Mexico, and his family crossed the border when they were young. And actually, at that time, it was actually encouraged. It was a different time, and so they came up here looking for a better opportunity. And so his tribe, somebody had drawn a border right there between Mexico and the U.S., and so that part of it became Mexico. And even here in California, this used to be a part of Mexico. But before that, it was all open land until that happened. So for his family, even I believe part of their migration was coming up through this area. That was no longer available. But their family came up anyways. And so his family moved up here. And the only work he could get was as a migrant worker. And so their family did that for years, and they actually worked up in Camarillo, around this area up here, and that was their life growing up.
Cool. And you mentioned that he ran a youth camp.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
So years later, as he actually got a art scholarship to a university, and at that point, the university was actually looking to implement some type of elective credit. This gentleman who had wrote a book on wilderness survival wanted to pilot this course, and it was basically wilderness survival 480. So it was an upper level class that you could take, and part of it was they would use his book as the text and go out into the wilderness. He met my father and invited him to actually be a part of teaching it because he realized my father already knew the skills. And a lot of this, he was leaning a lot on his mentor, who was a Apache man, to teach him what all these artifacts that he found when he was hiking. And so to have somebody there that grew up knowing the skills, it was a part of their life, he thought was a very important piece to implement into the curriculum that they had there. And so that's how he kind of met, and that all started. In the process of doing this course, because you basically had the classroom part of it, and then you're dropped off by a bus and then picked up 30 days later. So you had 30 days to implement what you learned with your crew. And if you were still alive, you passed the class. So it's kind of like one of those pass-fail.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, but they found it interesting enough that time on the land for these students was helping a lot of people who were dealing with one thing or another. If it was depression, if it was eating disorder. So a lot of the people who work in the behavioral health industry started recognizing that something interesting and impactful was happening on why they were out there on the land. Mm-hmm. And so then this whole idea of wilderness therapy was brought about in this era. And so from there sprung a whole bunch of different programs that do wilderness therapy, outings, the treks, all that kind of stuff. And so it started there at that university just by wanting to teach the old school way of living off the land.
And did you have some involvement in it
growing up? Yeah, so growing up. And so we actually we're up north in Utah. And at that time, my dad had a job that we were pretty good. We were pretty set. And then because he finished college, he moved on. And then he got married to my mom and then had a family. And then years later, this professor showed up again and said, I actually want to start a wilderness therapy program in Arizona. And so through a process of our family talking about it and praying about it, we ended up moving down to Arizona and starting the program. And I was about 10 years old at that time. And so from that time forward, we actually were working with our father. Every summer we're out there in the wilderness working with the youth, and they'd come from all over.
And what was that like for you growing up in that?
It was really cool.
Yeah.
At the beginning, it was really hard. So that lifestyle was really hard because you're starting with the bare minimum, working through that process. And every trek and every outing, you're doing the same thing.
And that's young. 10,
which is
11.
Yeah. So, and that was our life growing up. And me and my brothers, that's basically the way we go to school during the school year, and then summer we're out in the wilderness. And so that's kind of where everything kind of stems from for my journey with the art, and also with the hats and all that stemmed from the teachings of this idea of what impact do we have. I remember one of the first teachings my dad gave, because sometimes the students would take off. And so he was a master tracker. And so he would actually pull us out of school sometimes and be like, hey, I want to show you guys how to track and teach you guys this. And so we would go out with him, and he would talk to us about the footprint of the two-legged. And he'd talk to us about how no matter where you go, you leave a footprint. And so with that, you got to be mindful of where you step and where you go and where your feet are taking you. And so that was very apparent in our teachings growing up. And as time went on, and as we're getting more, becoming adults and getting more involved with the world around us, we realized that there is an impact that man has on the earth. And he always taught us about our stewardship, because we'd even learn about the plants and how what he would teach us was the law of the harvest, is what he called it. And basically what it was is that if you find food, if you find a plant that's edible and you find berries, you don't deplete it. You're very mindful of how much you gather. And even though you may be starving and you have a whole group that you need to feed, right? You're mindful because next year that crop is going to be necessary as well. So this idea of gathering what you need at the time and being mindful that there's an impact that you'll have later on the land and other animals and everything like that. So
it's incredible how many lessons are learned kind of just by observing on those kind of journeys like that.
And it's very immediate. So it's interesting because here we have a lot of buffers. So our choices, for example, like even buying a piece of clothing, like we don't feel the impact, but there are places where it's felt immediately, that impact of what's happening, and sometimes it takes years. You know, pollutants that are going back into the earth and all that kind of stuff. It takes time until it builds up until it's too late. And so that's the interesting thing about being out in nature, is like if you don't find food, you're immediately hungry, your energy goes down. If you don't drink water, same thing. And so you're learning how the cause and effect, how your choices, and I think that's why being out in nature with the youth who are struggling with some of their choices, it resonates, because then they see like every choice has an outcome, if it's now or 10 years down the road. And so with that, then they realize like, well, if I want to sleep good tonight, then I definitely want to get a fire going, and I want to build a shelter, because nights are long. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't, then I mean, your hours, I mean, you get to count the minutes, freezing.
Yeah, it kind of forces them to take immediate responsibility for like right here, right now.
And so then the next time they're like, okay, I'm going to build a shelter and build a fire. I'm going to make sure that I can sleep tonight. And so, but with that, then they start thinking about how the rest of their life is what are they building for the next day and for the next year. And so it has that type of impact because everything's so basic and so clear, instead of somebody telling you don't do that because this is going to happen, and you have really no way to gauge it in your understanding as a kid. Yeah.
So share a little bit about your mom.
So my mom is from Navajo Nation. There's a lot of different pieces about all that, but she actually grew up on the reservation, and then her life has been this in being going between both worlds and trying to. And the great thing about my parents is that they both their focus was on their healing, in hopes that it wouldn't be passed, the trauma wouldn't be passed down to us, the things that they experienced. And so that was really interesting. And now as we're circling back, we're starting to understand as adults all that they had gone through in their lives and continue to go through.
Yeah, and you mentioned often kinship. Language.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So one of the things, and this is one thing my mom is so adamant about, and it's because language has a big effect on who we are. For example, and now in the social climate, there are terms that are coming up that help us understand different pieces of all the cultures that are now here, and how the interaction looks like, the things that are detrimental and the things that are beneficial. And that helps the mind have clarity around that. In the Navajo language, it's a kinship language. And that was intended to help not only with this idea of that we work as a group, but this necessity and need of working together for survival. And that really is the idea. Even now in this world, like there's a big piece of it that we're missing, and that's like, we need each other to survive. If I'm over here making a mess on the ground and polluting the planet, that's affecting everybody, not just myself. So there's an interesting way of looking at things. In the old way of speaking, in a lot of tribes, there was no you or I. It was different versions of we. So this idea that we are all together in this. And that's something, so, like one of the things that we talked about was this idea of the effect that we have on each other. And so before this, you had the blankets that you were selling, and how that was having an effect on our communities, and without you even knowing. And so with that, the cool thing is like the process that we've been through has been in the works even before things have shifted in the climate here in America. And I think that's a very important piece, to be able, that you were willing to listen and be aware of that, because it's the same thing as like having that ability. And that's one thing too my father talked about with tracking, which is interesting because it kind of goes back to that. But he always talked about awareness. He always talked about not only looking at the track, but being aware of your surroundings. And the awareness was key in the idea of how do we bring in all our senses and what's happening here. And so in the sense of somebody who is a good tracker, they don't just look at the tracks. The second step is, how do you feel? Like what do you feel right now? What's happening inside you that you're reading but you can't really explain? And so in the sense of how things go, we all have an impact on our neighbor. And that's something that I think is a very important piece of being all stuck together on this continent,
Yeah, and taking that responsibility for yourself and and understanding how your actions are affecting the community. I'm reading the book Nonviolent Communication.
Yeah.
And one of the things that it talks about is that the number one pathway to violence is to not take responsibility for your own actions. And it really forces, like, instead of like playing the blame game, like blaming it's everyone else's fault, which we're seeing a lot of right now in our society. It's like we have all these problems, but then we're always very quick to point the finger at everybody else instead of taking immediate accountability and responsibility for the actions that we are, understanding that we're affecting other people.
Yeah.
We're affecting our own community. So that idea of kinship and the concept of we is so powerful.
Yeah.
And it's in such a deep root of Native history, of how you guys have always viewed community and caring for one another. The concept of sharing rather than owning has been a powerful discovery that I've learned from you.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's all based around this idea of kindness and how it affects another person. And so, and that's a very interesting piece about all this that we've been talking about for, what has it been, over a year now?
Yeah, close to.
Yeah, so it's been over a year. and the bits and pieces of it is because a lot of it we're looking at now in America. This is legal. This is what we can do, right? And the question that I felt was so important is if we should, it's the idea of like, if we should do it. We know we can, we can do a lot of things. And, but in the process of it, it's the way the Native community talk about it when they have counsel about their decisions is they say, how does this affect the 7th generation from now? And how does this affect people down the river from us? How does this affect others? And so the decisions are based off of that. Now this idea of how do I gain as much as I can? And it's interesting because America has become such a capitalist system that sometimes we lose sight of that because the way to provide for ourselves is now based off of money. And so now it's kind of changed everything from the society of being self-sustainable and living off the land and being in harmony with the land to a system that we felt was, because it has its pros and cons with it. But in the end of day, there are bits and pieces that we can ask ourselves, is this actually better? Is this adding to my overall health and well-being? Or is this making me more depressed? Is this keep me up at night? And so those are the important questions because if we sit as a human being that is whole and a being that has a heart at peace, our decisions are completely different. And if we can focus on that, not only will we be successful, then our interaction with humanity shifts a bit. And things that we thought were irrelevant become relevant. And things that we thought were so essential become irrelevant. So things shift. And that's one thing that I think is an important piece to look at because it really is not so much, because we were born into where we're at now. And that's the hard part because we know what we know. But even here in America, we're only 300 years old, if that. Before that, there are thousands of years of understanding and education and ways of living that we haven't even tapped into. And the Native Americans who held that were demonized for having that understanding. And so now we're in the stage of reclaiming, but so much has been lost. How do we do that? And so in that sense, I think a lot of the stuff that we have been talking about is like, how do we create room for that to happen? How do we not box out that ability to bring in a culture that has been pushed down for years? And how do we make space for that in a way where it makes sense?
For sure.
And that's a lot of conversation, but I feel like the steps that we have talked about give that space.
Yeah. And you playing your role in all of this and in kind of the format of an artist and an entrepreneur, take us back to where that kind of art entrepreneur journey began. You kind of mentioned it on the trail with times with your father, but when did that kind of start and when did you start to realize like I'm seeing that shift inside of me where I need to pursue this?
The art? So with the art, it was after work with my father, I started going back to school because I actually needed a degree to continue what my father was doing. But in that process, I had a feeling that I needed to start doing my art. And so then I actually started getting more involved with the Native community. And from there, it opened up a whole new world for me. Because before that, I was into nature. And in nature, I say the nature jokingly, but so before that, I was actually in nature and I was working with the youth out there consistently. And so, and we lived in Phoenix, Arizona. My reservation is north of there. So I didn't spend a lot of time there. It was only for the holidays and for family events that would go up there. But our life had situated down there with what we were doing. And so with that, then everything shifted when I was actually able to go back into the Native communities and spend the time there. And I realized a lot of things that I had not understood. Yeah. I would hear about, but didn't understand it until I was there actually witnessing a lot of things. And, a lot of people know about Standing Rock. That's one big movement, but there are so many that are happening every day in the Native community. Here where we're at, we're at not too far from a university where there's a cemetery for the tribes here, and they're building their parking lot on it. So the recognition is one of the pieces that the lack of recognition, the lack of viewing natives as human and always seen as a nuisance because people want more. And that's the frustrating part, is that was a continual thing that I saw happening over and over. No matter where I went, no matter what Native community I went to go visit and spend time with, there was something that they were trying to work on just so that their children could have food on the table.
And why art over anything else? Like, was there a specific reason?
Art, it was very organic. So my expression has always been art. And I think for a lot of the natives, like, art it's not, and we don't really see it as art. And that's the interesting thing. Like, we're using words that we wouldn't really use, but it's just a way of how we express ourselves and live day to day. Because you got to remember, even our clothing we made ourselves from buckskin, and we beaded it ourselves, or had our auntie bead it. So in a sense, everybody was a part of that process, because to provide for yourself, you had to create, you had to do all of that. And so it's interesting too, even the idea of like someone that labels himself a hunter. Back in the day, you're just a person.
Yeah.
So
So
with
we're all creators in some regard,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I'm telling you right now, I ain't painting that painting right there.
So in the process of painting, a lot of it was just me thinking, and painting was my outlet to try to understand. And I know that seems, you hear a lot of artists see that, but it really was like my expression of, for example, when I did the Native American Gothic, it was this, like, what would it look like now if the buildup of America was more of a collaboration, and so instead of what it actually was, and what would that look like? Because at the beginning we traded freely with everybody. We invited settlers to come, and that was disrupted because people found gold.
It was a shift of like you saying, what if?
Yeah, so that one's just basically like, what would it look like? And I thought there's some pieces that we would definitely use. Like, so if you look at it, you see like the denim overalls, right?
Yeah.
So there are bits and pieces that are very functional to what we do, and I see, our elders that they gravitate towards. And so that was kind of like that piece. But the interesting piece of it was at the end is that after that, I ended up at Standing Rock. And I saw people we had non-natives show up that were there to be with us. And so it's interesting because that was actually something, I was like, maybe I wasn't painting a picture of what if, or of the past. Maybe I was painting a picture of the future, of what it would look like if we could reclaim a lot of things that were lost. And so that began that push to, how do I do that in a way that resonates?
And with the entrepreneur aspect of it, of you actually starting a business, starting an online store, selling products, like, when did you kind of begin that journey of like, oh, wow, I think I'm going to start a business?
That's all kind of organic. It all just kind of fell into place when it was ready. And so I don't even know what the time.
The entrepreneur journey, man.
Yeah, well, and a lot of it is like I think a lot of it springs from that survival instinct. You know what I mean? It's like, how do we get from A to B and do it in a way where we can make it. We're living, and so
make it another day.
Yeah, and there's in the world today, there's not a lot of way to be successful outside of the standard way of living.
For
just
sure.
like getting a job, working for someone, all that kind of stuff. So.
And was there anybody in the Native community, you said when you like got plugged back in and you were kind of observing, was there anybody specifically that inspired you? Or was it just the community
overall? Yeah, watching them speak and watching people as they're trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the main places was Standing Rock.
Yeah.
But it was very inspiring because they talked a lot around showing a better way to live, a piece. It's interesting because a lot of people were like, this is horrible. We got to do something about this. We got to stand up for this. And the elders were clear on, we got to be an example of what that looks like. So, and that was key because they felt like things won't change unless you see and felt. And it's mostly like you see and you feel, you experience it, and it's a different way. And then that changes more a person's view than people telling you, that
For
kind
sure.
of stuff. So.
And when it comes to like the art community and specifically like the art that you're creating, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate when it comes to people who are non-natives being able to purchase art that's created by someone who is native?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The best way to gauge it is how it's affecting the native community. So for example, this country itself was built off this idea that there's manifest destiny, these natives don't deserve it, we do. Removal, genocide, and then put on land that they don't want. So in that process, then it's been a struggle for natives to get ahead of it because we don't own any of that land and we're still under the federal mandate on all of that. So we can't actually purchase it. So if I wanted to purchase a piece of land, it had to be off the reservation. And the process, that alone, so for the Native American, is still the pushing down of their ability to have generational wealth. On the reservations, there aren't a lot of jobs. The only jobs that they had were to continue with their lifestyle of doing artistic style work. Arts and crafts is what they call it. Yeah. And so in '94, they actually, because there was a lot of plagiarism happening around the jewelry because it became very popular in the 70s, they created the Native American Arts and Crafts Act, which was to protect the authentic work. But in that process then, and so the natives were now at a point where they felt like now we can actually provide for ourselves because it's nothing like here. Like there is no 7-Eleven down the street. And if you're going, for a lot of people, it's on a dirt road and you got to figure out how to it's a food desert on the reservation. The way the infrastructure and the funding is not given to the Native community, even though they're under the federal regulations. And we're not sovereign nations. We have to adhere to what we're being told in all those cases. So there's no way for us to actually get out of that rut right now. And so everybody's living on the survival, day-to-day survival mode. So it's like, oh, I gotta make money now because we can't, our land has been so depleted, we can't hunt and gather on it. Even communities that fish, now they're getting boxed out by big fishing companies. And so now we have the Native American Arts and Crafts where it's a big portion of what somebody who's on the reservation is trying to make money is trying to sell this, and now they're competing with the big industry, which is boxing them out. And the interesting thing is like for a Native community, they can't stop being Native. They can't take off their skin color and be like, okay, now I'm going to go out in the world. But for other people who are looking to also provide for themselves, it has an effect if they start going into that world. Because then it is taking away from the ability to provide. The only way that is left on the reservation to truly provide for yourself is taking that away. And so it's just like everything else. It's like, well, let's not buy these clothing because we have kids over here that are being put into sweatshops and that kind of stuff. So it's just that same idea of like, even though we can, like, how does it affecting? So appropriation, the word appropriation started springing up because like you're taking again for the Native community. And a lot of the people who are taking have the privilege, access, and ability to do so many other things, but they've chosen this, which is now boxing out this community yet again. And so...
so it's that taking versus supporting?
Exactly.
Okay.
So in that process, then, we love the inner commerce. We love working with Native and non-Native. And we want to continue that. But for that to happen, there needs to be an understanding. And it's not even like there needs to be a law. It's just an understanding of people. And people are socially aware. And people are inherently good and want to do the right thing. But they just don't have the information on how it's affecting. And so it's like, for example, your company, you're like, these patterns are awesome. We love them. We know they're going to sell. They're marketable. This is beautiful. And it is because they stem from years and years and years and years of history. Mm-hmm. And there's pieces that are embedded in there that have symbolism that I feel resonate. And that's why it's so beautiful. And so that's there. But the part where it becomes complex is like, how is this affecting the community that it comes from? Yeah. And the Native American community alone has a very unique situation that they sit in because we're still not recognized in so many ways. And this is all recent. And so that's why it's like we're all working towards a better future. And the growing is going to be tough. But even to practice our own ceremonies and to do our dances, it was outlawed and illegal. You'd go to prison up until 1978, the year I was born. And that's that's just how it
So
was, right?
recent.
Like, we're a country trying to figure out what it means to be born into this country with a lot of terrible history, right? And so in that process, like, this generation has the ability to change so much. Like, we've come so far already in a short amount of time. We come from slavery, we come from genocide, we've come from wars, and so we're now at a point to now we're settled in, and now we can figure out, well, where are the bits and pieces that are still harming communities that we're not aware of? Social media has been a great vehicle to deliver that message outside the reservation, because before that, when are you going to come across a Native American and have this conversation with them? They've already all been removed, right? And so now with social media and you having a platform where you can offer that to someone like myself to talk about these things, the collective consciousness, I feel like people are inherently good. When they get the information, they're like, oh, had no idea that's what I was doing. Let me go ahead and change some stuff. And we're seeing that right now with what we're working with. It's like, I want to do better, and it's hard because the system has not allowed for that in a lot of ways. You know, providing, and again, I go back to the providing for ourselves, because it wasn't like this 300 years ago. A man could provide for his family on his own without a boss. Yeah. And so with that, with all the shift in things, now we got to settle back in, is like, well, what can we balance out?
Yeah.
Can we have more of the self-sustainable way of living off the land, and also be involved with society and intercommerce and a way to buy and sell and have currency? And the answer, of course, is yes. You know, that's what that painting was like this idea of the future of how we do it. But now we're in that stage of realizing what else is there. And so that's what we see with the Black Lives Matter movement, is like, there's still some stuff happening. We were born from a white supremacist movement. It's like, white people came thinking, we're the best, we need this. And then that movement has shifted, but it's created everything. That's the foundation of America. But then their children are like, wait, that's not right. Like, we have met natives, we have people that we know who are not white, and we love them. So that wasn't right. But we're here, so let's figure out what we're going to do now. And so, but that's a part of being human. Like, even the Native community, there were tribes that were revered and were great and were honorable. And then we had renegades that were running around that were doing things that were not honorable. And so with that, then it's the collective shift of, okay, we understand we're human, we're working on stuff, and we're willing to correct it and to deal with that pain. Because once you realize you're in the wrong, it's hard. It hurts. And you're like, crap, like, what do I do? And there's that shame that comes with it. And guilt. Hopefully that's still intact, right? Because that's an indicator that helps us to shift to the right direction. So if you don't feel that, then that's where you should be like, why don't I feel that? But that is an important piece, because that helps us to calibrate where we need to be, right? And make amends. Because my feeling is, and what we've learned from working with youth and in nature, is that things can be made right. Sometimes it takes longer than other times, depending on what has been done. But the hope that things can be made right is what should outshine everything. And then the ability to do it, no matter the sacrifice. And that is the true way of living, where at that point, there's a sense that there's some things that become more relevant, and some things that become irrelevant, and some things that become essential, and then some things we're no longer needing. And so that way of life is what a lot of the elders called the greater way, the sage way of living, but where you're not bound to anything, but you're able to walk freely in the world. And so, and I think that's an important piece, that I think society is now recognizing that maybe there's something more, and what is that? And so we're shifting in that. But a lot of horrible stuff has happened throughout the years. But the communities, I know, like a lot of the communities are voicing a lot of things, and outside communities like, no, I can't. That's not really what's happening. And I think that that part of it needs to be looked at, because the communities have been very clear. Like Black Lives Matter, the big movement that happened recently, like, that's nothing new, right? We've been hearing that for years. It's like, there's a higher rate of this, and things need to shift within even in our system of our our police system. But I think it's important to take that time to listen and to adjust, because that will create a better future for everybody. And right now, even with our planet, we are on a bit of a time frame.
Yeah, for sure. And there is definitely an increasing of awareness of what's going on a societal level, and a lot of the issues are being exposed. And I want to come back to the concept of cultural appropriation, because I think that is a very kind of more made aware realization of what's happening. And I want to dive in a little bit on that, because it's a topic that a lot of people easily can avoid and really not want to come to understanding that it does exist. But can you define in kind of a simple way, but I know it does have different forms, but what is cultural appropriation?
So cultural appropriation is taking from a culture and profiting off of that without giving back to the culture. And so, for example, you asked if it's okay for us to buy native-made stuff. Yes, absolutely. Like that's a piece that we appreciate, is when you come to us and you buy a hat from us.
That's
and
supporting, not taking.
Supporting, and you're putting money back into the communities. It's when you're taking that and making money off of it, when you have no understanding of the background behind it, and also the years and years of artistry and generations of artistry that add to that piece and make it that beautiful. You're just copying and taking, making, and then you're putting that in your pocket. And so that's the part where it becomes very complex, because we're kind of stuck in the system where it feels like everything's a trap, you know? We don't have the ability to move freely. We have to work with the system. But there's also so many other options that other communities have to work with. And that's what we're asking, is like, look at those options. And plus, like, you come from a rich history too. At some point, your people had their own culture and own history. Like, for example, like, what is your background? I don't think I've ever asked you. Like, where's your family from originally?
Yeah, so based on Ancestry.com, I come from Ireland.
Ireland.
But kind of the more immediate is I'm actually from the Dalton gang. And so the Dalton gang was cousins with Jesse James, and they were like marshals and sheriffs turned bank robbers. But they were just wronged by the government in that time. And so there was a lot of narrative going around about the Dalton brothers, that they were these horrible people, and they were like, all right, if we're going to be seen as this, then we're going to start shifting, or we're going to start creating our own narrative. And they started robbing trains and banks, and they started to, it's a fascinating history. But so the Dalton gang is really incredibly famous. When you Google Bob Dalton, I don't come up. Yeah, Bob Dalton was the leader of the Dalton gang. And
So kind of like Robin Hood, huh?
Yeah, I like to think so. I think there's some legit criminal stuff going on, but yeah. So I come from kind of a lineage of bank robbers, gang members, and alcoholics, and I'm the first one in my family that really is trying to make that shift. Of my dad was an alcoholic, my grandpa, so on and so forth, and yeah, I just come from. It's hard to make a generational change.
Yeah.
You know, the generational curse is a really real thing, and it's hard to move in a different direction. And so, yeah, I want to get to the point where I can help kind of redeem the Dalton name into where, when you Google Bob Dalton, you know, it doesn't come up as outlaws and bank robbers. It's more for trying to shift that narrative to something positive and making a difference. So,
and it's interesting that your history even before that in Ireland is full of rich cultural history, right? And I've seen some of the Celtic designs and some of the other artistry that is amazing. And so, and I think again, like a lot of it is like looking back a little further, because at some point a lot of us were separated from our roots in one way or another. And I think that's right. A lot of the native designs resonates because it hasn't been that long ago that we have been. And so, but digging back into your culture, there are a lot of pieces there that are just as beautiful that I think need to be recognized. And there should be a lot of a sense of pride in all that too, in the sense of, you know, what you can tap into. So even though you're moving away from doing the native inspired blankets, to look and see like what more is there, you know, what more am I not celebrating about my past that I do, like that's my lane, that's my arena that I could there's so much there. And I feel like that's a part that a lot of people are missing out on, even here in America, because they want to identify as American, but also there's more to it. Like there's years and years of culture that some of it has just been forgotten.
Yeah. One question I don't think I've ever asked you that I've always been a little bit curious on, there's this phrase that's like imitation is the highest form of flattery. Mm-hmm. Is that true in your opinion, and how does that play into this kind of concept of people utilizing designs or making of things because it is coming from this beautiful, rich history, but and it might play into the taking versus supporting. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a term talking about intent versus impact, and that's a real thing in the sense of like my intent was to flatter, my intent was to honor, but what impact does that have? Because we're humans, we do our best we can with our knowledge, and that's the understanding needs to be had is like we do the best we can with what we understand, but if we don't understand it, then and we learn about it, then we can make a shift at that point. So there's always that choice, and the roads go two ways on there when we hit those crossroads. So in that, like, that's an interesting phrase because we actually brought it up earlier today is like imitation is the best flattery. But the piece that I've always heard is until it happens to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So like,
and that's in the artist world. It's like, what is going on, you know?
It's like imitation is the highest form of robbery.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a sense there. It's like, I mean, you can make a saying out of anything.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
And if it resonates, it resonates. If it's clever, it's clever.
It was probably created to justify at some point back then.
Or just someone wanted to feel good about it, and they're like, man, these people are taking so much from me, and, you know, but at least, you know, it means I'm doing good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll dive in a little bit on kind of the way that we connected and kind of my own personal journey with cultural appropriation, because I was going into 2020 with the desire to learn from the Native community and really just figure out how I can use my platform to help support in any way that I can on what's going on with little to no education at all. I just, for whatever reason, I had that pull and that desire. And that's when I got introduced to you and a couple other folks. And one of the first conversations that you and I had were, what if I told you that some of your designs were offensive to the Native community and that I wanted you to get rid of them? And through those conversations, I was able to really do a deep dive on where and why and how we ended up even carrying these blankets that ended up becoming some bestsellers in our company for many years, the Arrow and the Mojave and the Diamond blankets. And super well loved and purchased by many thousands of people in our community. And through our conversations I was having with other people, it was that realization of, because what's hard is, it's very culturally accepted. Like, a lot of people are using Native inspired designs. It's become very accepted. So it doesn't feel like this, like one person does it and it stands out and that's a huge, you know, negative thing. It's very much across the board. Many companies are doing it. So when we selected the designs, we did it because they were cool designs, beautiful colors. We kind of created our own colorways around them. And then when we started having conversations and I started to understand the implications of them, it was the fact that I wasn't doing any sort of copyright infringement. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't specifically choosing these designs to steal them from a particular tribe. But at the end of the day, that doesn't make it right. And it's because we were keeping opportunity and resources from artists that have these designs, that we could be keeping opportunity and resources from them. And so for me, that kind of journey of understanding that I'm culturally appropriating because I am using my business to sell designs that could be keeping resources and opportunity away from people. That was, like you were saying, that's what was that internal, like, wow. So I just, we came out with a letter in our company to address that. But, it's one thing to do that through a letter and really write it out and process that. But I just think it's important for me to apologize to you and the Native community for spending those years of selling those things and keeping those resources and opportunity away from people without knowing. My intent wasn't necessarily wrong, but my implications ended up resulting in that. And so we decided to donate a portion of the past sales of all of our Arrow Mojave and Diamond blankets and donate to Native NGOs over the next year, which will total a little over $100,000. But I think it's important for people to know that we didn't make that decision to avoid punishment from a community, and we didn't make those decisions to be rewarded. We made those decisions because we felt like that was the most life-giving decision that we could make as a company moving forward in wanting to do the right thing. And so ultimately that led us to the opportunity to have conversations with you and do a little bit more of collaborative conversations around what could we potentially do together that's beyond both Sackcloth and Ashes and your platform and what we can make a difference. And before we talk a little bit about our partnership and what we could potentially and what we plan to do, talk a little bit about blankets in the Native culture.
So it's interesting that your company chose blankets because for the Native community, that's had a lot of deep-rooted history behind it. One of for natives trading blankets is a big deal. It's a part of ceremonies, everything like that. The process of what had happened to a Native community, there's even triggers in the blanket gifting, especially from the white community to the Native community, because that's how smallpox was spread, and many of our people were lost because of that, and that was very intentional. And so with that, then we're whittled down to 250,000 people total, and that's across over 560 tribes, right? So that's, we're talking about a few people here and a few people there. So that's what we bounce back from. So in that process, the blankets we especially for the Navajos, having sheep and making the wool and spinning the wool, there's a process to it. There are prayers and songs that go along with it, which put that all together. And we feel that that's so important because that also adds to our understanding that we are sacred. And so everything that we do has a protocol, procedure, all that behind it. And even in the hats that we make, we put elements in there and specific symbols in there so that the person wearing it is reminded that they are sacred, that they have a direction. They need to be reminded who they are and where they come from. And that's our invitation. And if you look at the old way of dressing, it's beautiful and it stands out, and it's because every piece is intentionally placed. So with the blankets themselves, there's a long history that has to do with how do we dumb down this genocide that just happened. So then they started writing books about cowboys and Indians, right? And how the noble Indian, the noble foe, all that kind of stuff. And then with that sprung this really interesting obsession with native stuff. And Buffalo Bill also, showcased natives and all that kind of stuff. And in the intent, and some of it was good intended, and others was just like, we don't want to talk to our kids about what just happened. This is really rough stuff. So let's just make it cowboys and Indians, something we play on the playground, that kind of stuff. But from a different perspective, looking at it even from, let's look at Germany and what happened there, the genocide there. You don't see people playing Jews and Nazis, right? And so it's interesting how far we can come in changing the narrative. So with that, with the blankets, we no longer had access to making wool. And during World War II, not only did we have Navajos out there doing code talking, the government was taking sheep from us so that they could send that to those who were deployed, right? And without asking. So communities were being taken from. So then we couldn't make our own blankets anymore. So at that point, then we, with these ceremonies that had been built around so much meaning, we had to figure out where to go. And there are only a few resources that we could tap into. So then that's when there's this whole interesting thing that happened with the blankets. And so even though natives have kind of come to terms like that's the only way that we're going to get access to it is if somebody non-native makes it and then we purchase it. But that's the survival mode. It's like kind of like Stockholm syndrome, right? Where the mentality changes so that you can survive in a situation that you're in. And so, so with that, then how do we repair that? How do we look at that so that everything is, the wrong that's been done can be corrected in a good way, and it gives a sense of worth back into those communities that had so much meaning in everything that they did, and so I think that's why a lot of people in America resonate with so many other cultures as well, like yoga and some of the other things that are they're looking for a sense of meaning. And it can get muddied up because that search for it, you're going to be looking in every way and needing it in every way. But the meaning of who you are can be found in doing your lineage, like finding out where you come from and looking into that and enhancing what you do in your own way. And so a lot of that is an invitation of looking back into your own history and that kind of stuff. And so, but yeah, so.
And it's a big part of just ceremonies and everything.
For blankets?
Blankets, yeah.
Yeah, and that's all of it's like this evolution of what had happened here in America. And so with that, you know, the blankets itself, we were never at a point because we couldn't even vote until later on. We couldn't be a part of society and still were like kept corralled in these invisible prison type camps, you know. And so with that, we're finally getting to a space to where we can merge out and feel comfortable going out off the reservations and living in this world. And even though it's not something that's built to enhance our lives, we're able to manage it. And so, and then the education too, we don't get the best education on the reservations and we don't get the best healthcare. We saw that with COVID. Like, there's not the same resources that are put into a city off the reservation like we have here in California. You know, we have places here where we can go get COVID tested, we can walk down into the store, all that kind of stuff. On the reservation, they don't get those resources. And so I feel like a lot of that's intentional because there's a lot of power behind the culture itself. And that was a very scary thing for the first people who came here, pushing the natives out, is because there's so much power in that. And so the fear might be still in that. And so allowing the space for that to continue and understanding that we do have an impact on our footprint. And realizing, well, what more can I do to help in this, in where I live, in my community, and in my country.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why we decided to discontinue the native-inspired designs and make the decision moving forward that we're only going to create designs in-house and in collaboration with artists that are going to specifically design collections that are making some specific difference.
And even with that, I feel like there's a space where now it can be passed on to native businesses and say, hey, we're not going to touch any of that. You guys go for it. I'm going to dig into what I can do independently, and I'm not even touching that culture. And that's the one thing that would be greatly appreciated from the Native community, because we've never had that. Everybody comes for something. On Navajo Nation, we're still trying to fight for our water rights. We have 4 states around us, and they all get water. And the water that we get, they get to use for their electricity. And you probably never heard that, because that's not something that's made public. It's something that's ongoing with the Native community. And the more that I am involved with my community, the more I realize the atrocities that still exist. Not much has changed. There's this illusion that everybody is free. But unfortunately, that's really not the case. And so our battle is not because we're upset for ourselves. Our battle is because now we have young ones that are have been brought into this life, and we don't want them to deal with that or have to even we want that whole idea of coexisting with native and non-native to be something that is so natural and free and wonderful.
Yeah.
But for that to happen, we do have to look at all these things and make a stand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And collaborating is a huge step forward, I think, in just demonstrating partnership in the midst of differences, but really showing this is how we are similar, and and it's bigger than us.
Yeah.
And
also, and the other piece too is because the collaborations also, you have to look at individuals coming in.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people, because we've been offered collaborations on this and collaborations on that, and it's great and we like that, but sometimes it's not a good fit. Sometimes it's like, well, like that could work, but it's not going to help anything.
Yeah.
And so again, like the way that we think is the seventh generation, how are we going to affect that? How are we going to provide for them? How are we going to bring things together so it works in harmony? And so that's why, like, for example, like we initially started on this idea of like, let's collaborate on blanket, and then there's a percentage that goes to everybody. And then at that point, there wasn't this idea that we could actually have ownership of it back. And as the climate shifted and now we're looking at all these other pieces, it's like, well, maybe there's a better way. And that is allowing the Native community just to, whenever they're ready, they do it on their own. Until then, everybody step back, allow that to happen, give space so that we can figure out. The unfortunate thing is that it might be a long road, because right now we're dealing with 10 different things on the Navajo reservation, and things that no other communities have to deal with. And so our process, everything we do, we have to decide, is this portion of time going to be used for this, or is it going to be used for this? And the immediate always wins. And that's why it's taken us so long to get to making hats. That's why it takes so long for us to even all the stuff, when you're messaging me, I'm like, we want to respond to this. I need time to process. And there's 10 other things that we're dealing with at the same time. And so we want to get to a point to where next generation doesn't have to deal with that. They can get a message from somebody and be like, okay, I can respond, because the world is free from all that clutter. But for that to happen, there has to be people willing to look at it, push for it, and provide that.
Well, you're on the front lines, and it's an honor that you would even consider us to partner with us. And you designed a blanket collection for Sackcloth Ashes. What was kind of the inspiration behind that particular design? Yeah.
So the pieces that we have, because a lot has been taken. So what we're trying to do is reclaim a lot of those pieces that we know are ours, and there's symbolism and all that embedded in it. The blankets that we design in collaboration with you, so that, and it's great because not only did you stop the native design blankets, but you're also willing to give a percentage. And there's only one other time I saw that happen, and it was with another company that was working with Urban Outfitters, where they're willing to give a percentage back. And just that act alone creates a lot of healing within our communities. And then the next piece is that this line that we're doing, proceeds are going all to the Native community. And one of those is the Sovereign Bodies, which is a Native NGO that focuses on helping women. And so in that, then the proceeds go back to that, and
to be clear, 100% of the proceeds.
Yeah, 100%. So you're not getting anything. You put the money forward to get these blankets, and we're doing a run of 2,000, and all that's going back to the Native community, me as an artist, and then to Sovereign Bodies. And so that's a very beautiful thing. And so those types of collaborations and working together are needed. So, because you went into helping homeless because you saw a need of people who needed that. And so sometimes the need is to give, sometimes the need is to step back and allow. And other times the need is just to listen, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that process, every situation is different to find a specific need. And that's the one thing that we have appreciated as Native Americans and as humans, is those that come to listen, come to our table and listen. And listen to what we're asking, because we experience our life on a daily basis. And so we're going to have a better understanding of things that will be beneficial for our communities, for our families, for our clans, and for our relatives. And that's a part of the process. And again, it's all just this learning experience, figuring it out. And if we're able, the walking of we is being able to incorporate everybody where they're at, and to understand that our our impact and what we choose to do should take a consideration of where their lives begin. So there's like that line there. And so, and that's a way of interacting with kindness.
And with the impact that this particular collection is making, it's twofold. One is 100% of the proceeds are donated to sovereign bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Share a little bit real quick about sovereign bodies.
So Sovereign Bodies is a amazing organization, and they're grassroots. It's women. So women started this, and what they offer is a lot, but what they talk about is how they're helping women who are in situations where they need help, Native women. And so Native Americans have the biggest rate of assault on women, murdered and missing Indigenous women. And because we're on these plots of land that are federal, state, and tribal, jurisdiction gets tossed around, and people are experiencing a high rate of women who are being taken, women who are murdered, and on and on and on. And so for that to be corrected, organizations like this one have popped up where they're doing all the effort on their own without having any resources available to them. And so that's why we feel it's so important, because right now the resources is the funding, right? And they can do so much with funding because they can bring more people in and help more people. So not only is it just the fact that we're putting the sales back into that organization, but then also your platform has a great reach. So then it makes more people aware where they can donate and continue to contribute into that.
Yeah.
And so it's twofold. It's a very beautiful way of redirecting the narrative.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand about the murdered and missing Indigenous women that has been happening ever since settlers came, and has continued, unregulated. And so with that, then just having more understanding around it will help improve things as well. And people are free to donate and help out with that situation.
Yeah, they're doing amazing work, and we're going to be able to do a follow-up interview with Anita.
Yeah. She is amazing. And again, like, all this stuff is grassroots, meaning that there was a need and these people stepped up to the bat.
And she's putting in the work on the front end.
Yeah, and like hours and hours. Like sometimes I can't even get a hold of Anita because she's just busy.
So sovereign bodies. And then the second is typically when somebody buys a Sackcloth and Ashes blanket, it comes in a box, and when you pull your blanket out, it says, take it a step further, fill the box up with the following items, and donate to your local homeless shelter. We're trying something a little new for this collection, which is take it a step further, place the following items in this box, and we're providing a shipping label inside of the box that people can put the shipping label on, send it out, and it goes directly to an organization called Families to Families on Navajo Nation. Share a little bit about Families to Families.
So we have a lot of little organizations that have popped up, and Families to Families is one that, again, what it says is we're trying to help families. And so this is an important piece because, like I was talking about, and I think a lot of people don't understand the situation in these Native communities where we don't have a lot of resources. And even communities that have casinos and other things like that, the resources go out. There's owners of the casinos that are not Native that have built a partnership and take the lion's share of what's happening. And then the rest gets given to who we sometimes don't even know what that looks like. And so, so having more resources put back into the community in these organizations that are independently Native run, Native owned, they can be used correctly in helping the problems that are persisting in these communities. Yeah. And that's why we talked about, should we give it to a tribe? And it's like, well, the organization's already impactfully doing it. So let's give it to where we know you're going to get the bang for your buck. Where that they will make sure that money is used correctly, but also they'll stretch it out as much as they can.
Yeah, and I got to go see firsthand the work that they are doing, and it's as grassroots as it can get.
Which one? Where?
Over to Families, work with Alicia.
Yeah. And
to see Alicia, Franklin, the whole family taking and distributing resources to each home on the reservation is as grassroots as you can get. They fill up the truck, they fill up the water, and they head out.
So that one's interesting because that sprung up from a need of the COVID. And still the money has not been given to Navajo Nation. There's promised over $600 million. And that's meant to be somehow worked out with a community that's 250,000 to 400,000, somewhere in that range. No one really knows. And so, but yeah, that's grassroots and all volunteer.
And they're doing amazing work. So the resources, even if it's just in the sackcloth box, goes a long way.
Yeah.
They need resources. They need hygiene products.
Yeah, so everything goes directly to the communities that need it, and it's on an individual basis, which is nice. Yeah. And that's one thing that's unique, is that they know these families, and some they find, because some people are out in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes they're the only ones that know where they're at.
Yeah.
And to find them, to make sure they have what they need.
Well, I think the collection's going to do amazing. I can't wait to sit down and actually have a conversation with Anita and learn more about sovereign bodies, which we'll be able to share. In closing, a word that I hear from you often is reharmonization.
Yeah.
Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay. Which is not a word that I don't believe I've ever heard until you started saying it. What is your hope?
Yeah, it's just being able to be. My hope is that we can create a space where all of us can be together in the same room and not feel like we're any different, and in the sense of being human. That the differences are celebrated and looked at in a positive way rather than negative, and what separates us. And then find the things that are similar and celebrate those as well. But also the idea of reharmonization is nothing new. I think all our people, because we're all indigenous at some point, right? Our family came from grassroots. They came from the land. To remember that, and also remember that there is a way to walk in harmony and to work one with another. And there's a word that the natives are talking about, saying decolonize, which is a direction away from something. They feel that for me, reharmonization is like where we're headed, and that's a more beautiful thing, because I think it's a more ancient way and a more substantial way of doing things, is finding the way that harmony can exist. Because we see it in nature. If you spend time out there, you see nature every day. You see harmony, and that's why it's so healing.